Hello, and today I am joined with Andi Brierley, who's joining me from Leeds, and I'm so excited to speak to him because he's just written his story and he is working in criminal justice system. He has been around the criminal justice system, and he is here to share with you some of the things that he has learned through his writing, through his work, and through his own lived experience within the criminal justice system. Welcome, Andi. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'm quite blessed and privileged to be asked to come on, actually, looking at some of the people that you spoke with today, let alone over the last couple of months while I've been watching who you're speaking to. So thank you very much for inviting me.
It's my pleasure. And, you know, we've met a couple of times at various conferences. And I think what we share, which is what I hope that I share with all the people who come on to the programme, is that passion for creating change. Now, I want you to just take me back to 1998. I want you to just take me back to what was going on for you in 1998, not least because it was just over 20 years ago. And, you know, we're having this conversation now from a very, very different place than the one that you were at in 1998. What was going on for you that year?
Well, in 1998, I was a young person that had experienced care and everything that leads up to going into care. From a very, very the best way to describe it was that my mum was in care as a child and fell pregnant with me when she was 16 and in a residential home, and subsequently had 5 children by the time she was 24. And sometimes I think about that in the context of the way I'm living my life at the moment, because my daughter is 4 in November. I'm 37 with a full-time job. And I find it parenting one of the most difficult things I've ever done in my life. So to think that my mum had 5 children at 24 years old on benefits with very little support around her, is just an incredible thing to think about. So lots of things that happened in the house with my mum's lack of capacity to keep me safe, if you like. And then I entered care. That was around 1989. Then I had lots of movements in terms of some movements in care and a lot of my mum moving around. And so by the time 1998 came around, I think I'd had around 18 places to live. So if you think about that and put that into context, that's over a place to live a year by the time you're 13, 14 years old. And so school was very difficult for me because I've fallen so far behind academically, but also it was the structures and the boundaries that are in school that I found incredibly difficult to adhere to. And so a lot of the time wasn't there. And when I did go, the teachers said that I was quite difficult and challenging, which was true as far as I can remember. And so they excluded me. And this was in Stoke-on-Trent. I've been born and raised in Leeds, but my mum moved to Stoke-on-Trent because she met a man, and then school didn't really understood that I'd been in care, etc. from in Leeds, where we're a lot better now in terms of course, communicating from local authority to local authority. But back then they just seen the presenting behaviour and the fact it was too difficult and excluded me from school. So by 1998, what that meant is that I was 16 years old and being looked after by a parent that had been deemed incapable of keeping me safe previously, and so was struggling to supervise me, and some older adults seeing that I was addicted to drugs. And I would say, we use the word child criminal exploitation now, but that word just didn't exist in 1998. No. And basically what they did is they seen that I was taking heroin at 16. So when the rest of my peers at school were taking their GCSEs, I was taking heroin and starting to get it was a beginning of a heroin addiction. And some older peers just seen that was an opportunity for them to get me to sell drugs for them. And of course, I, at the time, needed to fund a drug addiction. And so what fundamentally happened was I got embroiled in a kind of criminal underworld that I couldn't have really fully understood at 16 years old. And the older males made quite a considerable amount of money off me. And when I look back now, at the time, of course, I didn't see it. And even as a 23, 24, 25-year-old person, until I became a professional, and not even until I became a professional, but until recently, when we talk about county lines and child criminal exploitation, and writing my book, of course, it then dawns on me that actually the police were chasing me to arrest me, and they eventually arrested me and put me in prison for 18 months for possession with intent to supply a Class A drugs. But when the judge sentenced me, I'll never forget that he said that at that time in 1998, heroin had kind of really hit the streets of Stoke-on-Trent, and it was a problem for the authorities to deal with. And so when the judge sentenced me to 18 months, he effectively said something along the lines of, you need to be made an example of, because people need to know that they can't get involved in the supply of heroin in Stoke. And looking back, I think, like, why was that my responsibility? You know, I was a victim of the drugs that were coming into the city. I was also a victim. And in some ways, the authorities, I mean, they wouldn't have known because we didn't talk about it like that back then. But I was caught in a car with the older Peter. He was 23 years old. He was caught in the car with me, and my brother was with me, who was only 15 years old. And they effectively dropped the charges against him and allowed me to serve an 18-month jail sentence. And so when I look back at that now, the one thing I wouldn't ever say is that I shouldn't have gone to prison, because I don't think that's really down for me to say that, you know, I committed a crime. In terms of proportionality, I was sentenced in court and I went to jail for 18 months. But when I look back, that guy should have been right beside me in the dock at the very least, getting sentenced. And the fact that the police didn't pursue that and didn't put two and two together and charge him effectively with the supply of drugs as well is just amazing to think about, really, when you think about how we are now.
It's unbelievable. I mean, it really is unbelievable when we hear those stories, when adults give voice, because they have the opportunity to reflect back through the lens and eyes of an adult who has recovered from those experiences. It's quite horrifying how many opportunities there are to intervene with that young person that are simply missed. And I guess that's why the title of your book is it Can I Tell You a Story?
Your Honour, can I tell you my story? Yeah.
Can I tell you my story? And I guess that's where it comes from.
Yeah, I think for me, it's an age-old question, and I get into lots of debates, as you can imagine, having criminal justice experience and working in the criminal justice system, and about the age-old philosophical question, nature and nurture. It was funny because actually at work today, I asked two young people, both had been in care and both had been involved in criminal justice. Actually, three, actually. And all different experiences of the criminal justice system. And I just asked them, I said to them, do you think, because I knew I was going to come and speak with you today, so I said, how do you think it's more about the choices that you make or the environment in which you grow up in? And bear in mind, these were 14, 15 and 17. And all three of them agreed that it was both things, both things. And then, so I gave them I said, if you were looking at a pie chart, and you guys had 100%, what percentage would you give to environment and what percentage would you give to your own personal choices? And I found it quite interesting that actually all three of them went above 50% for the environment. All three young people currently experiencing what I experienced as a child, they believe that it's more to do with their environment, but didn't shift responsibility. Because, you know, they could have quite easily said, look, it's 100%, it's not to do with me, it's all my environment. They didn't do that. I think one went 60, one went 70, and the other one went 65, 70, somewhere along the lines. But I just found that an interesting conversation to have with young people, because they can recognise it. They know that actually it's the home environment, the wider context in terms of quite often the disadvantage that they're growing up in, poverty, and also mixed in there their own personal choices and in terms of group membership, who they gravitate towards, etc. That's without them even kind of recognising trauma or complex trauma or toxic stress and neurological development, etc.
Or even intergenerational trauma, or even exactly. Yeah, so that's very interesting, because, you know, I still come across adults who don't have that kind of internal insight. I mean, by the time we've talked about neuroscience and attachment and we've done all of that stuff, then they kind of get it. But for them to have that without any of that knowledge, I think it's really interesting that they're having those kind of conversations. And you know what, that you're asking them. I don't remember anyone asking me those kind of questions, you know, those kind of questions that enable them to reflect, ponder, think, go within, all those skills that will serve them at some point. So you're 16, you've just done 18 months, you get released. What does that look like?
So I went to Brinsford Young Offenders Institution. Of course, I'm from Leeds and moved to Stoke. And whilst I was in prison, my brother also went to prison. Although he was in the car with me, he didn't, because I took the responsibility for the drugs, he didn't get any sentence for that, but he'd done some burglaries. He was in a residential home at the time. And he'd been sentenced. So we were both in Brinsford Young Offenders Institution. And of course, the relationship with this man broke down. And then my mum decided to move back to Leeds because the problem lied in Leeds. The problem didn't lie with us as a family. It lied in Stoke, sorry. So she moved back to Leeds. And so I don't think these are things that people are talking about. Whilst I was in Young Offenders Institution, the anxiety, let alone the fear that I faced whilst in a young offenders institution, because the sheer level of violence that goes on. I mean, I'd had quite a violent childhood, and it's interesting when we talk about the word resilience, because I think I lacked the skills to navigate myself around life without getting involved in the criminal justice system or completing school, etc. But I don't believe that I lacked resilience. I think that resilience started to look a different way for me because I was surrounded by violence. So I started to feel like I needed to be violent to protect myself, which in my view is a sense of resilience. But even having that lifestyle, when I landed in Brinsford Young Offenders Institution, it was mind-blowing. The level of violence that young person was portraying on other young people was just, and they were mainly from Birmingham, so they had two gangs in there, the Johnson's crew and the Burger Bar crew, and I'd never known anything like that. But you know, the sheer willingness to use weapons against each other and attack staff, it was just absolutely something that I'd never experienced. So you had that. And then what you also had is the fact that when I was released from custody, I'd had such a disjointed, chaotic childhood that I knew I was going back to Leeds. But we'd moved away from Leeds when I think I was about 13, so I didn't have any ties there. So I'm now 17 years old and I'm about to be released to Leeds. I've got no friends. I've got no education. When I went into Brinsford, I had a very, very serious heroin addiction. And so I had no idea what life was going to look like when the doors opened. And I was actually released from Onley in September of '99. And then by the time I got home, my brother had been released and the kids had started to take control of the house. My mum found it very difficult to challenge us as we started to get older and started to take a little bit of control. Mum's not got a bad bone in her body, but lots of capacity problems through neglect and abuse that she experienced. And I'd say probably unlike myself, I've still got a relationship with her. I still love her. She still loves me. But, you know, I've just got to come to accept that not everybody recovers from these early life experiences. And so she struggled so by the time I'd come home, and I would say I was probably the most structured out of us all, the kids had taken control of the house. So I'll never forget when I walked into the house, there was pretty much all the young kids that had probably nothing to do on the estate. They were all in my house. So I'd spent my time in Brinsford kind of, I'd say hope is the best word to use, that when that door opens, something good's going to happen. And yet I walked into a house where I didn't know any of these people. They were all drinking and celebrating my release. And the truth is, I didn't want them there. So I can remember going, it was a 3-bed house, and obviously there were 5 of us as young people, so there was a small bedroom with the 2 of us. And I can remember going upstairs after, they're all, hi Andy, how you doing? And they're all smoking weed, I'm drinking. And I can remember going upstairs to my bedroom and just sitting on my bed and just wanting to scream, because that's not what I envisioned myself coming out to upon release. that wasn't going to give me the platform, if you want, or the springboard for me to go off and do all the things that I aspired to do. And that was really an issue of a part of my narrative, about a part of my journey, is that actually as a family, we become toxic for each other.
Mm. So where did you know, because what's your job role now, Andy? Please tell people your job role.
I'm the child looked after and care leaver specialist, and I work for Leeds Youth Justice Service. So I predominantly work with the young people who come into the criminal justice system from the care system, and kind of struggle between youth justice and children's social work service in Leeds.
So you're the person who wasn't there for you, that you needed to be in post to support you to move into the next part of your life. Is that right?
Yeah. So as a result of coming out of Brinsford on the Young Offenders Institution, I'd then created an identity, as well as all the experiences that had kind of impacted on my inability to function properly. I would say that's probably the best way to explain it. But now I'd got this identity. I can remember having a chip on my shoulder, and I can remember thinking that because I'd been to Brinsford, and because I knew Burger Bar crew, and I knew Johnson's crew, because as human beings, we hold on to our own experiences and place value on them. That's what keeps us safe. And so that's what I was doing. So you could have come to me and said to me, I've been to Indonesia to meet, Indigenous people. I've been to Australia. But I'd thought, you don't know what you're talking about, though, because you haven't been to Brinsford. That's what you're thinking. So I'd created this identity, and what that identity did is impact on me going to custody another 3 times after that. And so now in my role, what I try to do is kind of work on what I've learned really about trauma and about relationships, and about how it's relationships that are fundamental to our neurological development. And so I'm in quite a privileged position to be able to recognize that actually it was the lack of them constructive relationships that impacted on my negative choices. And so therefore my primary aim, regardless of what the child's done or where the child comes from, is to just build the relationship first. And so we've got these institutional things called assessment, plan, intervention, supervision, which everybody has to do, and they have to be regulated. But as far as I'm concerned, they're secondary to my practice, because many young people that enter the care system have experienced trauma or toxic stress, or haven't had them constructive relationships. So I'm blessed. I feel absolutely privileged to be able to do what I do with the young people that I get to do it with on a daily basis. And I think, touching upon what you said earlier, I think it's key to be able to, and I think the criminal justice system there's a massive gap here, because actually when I work with a young person, they know by me coming into contact with them that I've come into contact with them because they've done something wrong. So let's park that. There's no point in banging on about it, because you already know it, I already know it. We'll have a quick chat about it, but let's park it, because I need to see who you are, and I need to see where you come from, and I need to learn your story. And I don't think people necessarily in the criminal justice system from a service user experience, they're scared of doing that because they feel like they're shifting responsibility away from you. So the whole criminal justice system, in my opinion, is a deficit-led industry. Yeah. Because it just fundamentally wants to work with you on the basis that you've done something wrong and improve them choices that you're making. And I just don't work like that, because I want to see you as a person. I want to help you on your strengths. I want you to move yourself forward. And like you said, nobody had them conversations with me. Nobody in all the programs that I did in prison ever said to me, "Did you have it difficult, Andy, as a child? Let's have a conversation about that. Let's understand what the impact of having all them criminals around you as a child has done on your decision making." Them conversations never happened, and they're not really difficult conversations to have. People talk about being therapeutic, but actually these conversations, they're just relational conversations that you have.
And I think you're spot on, actually. And when I did some training with a lot of probation workers, one of the things that they took from it, I'm told, was developing that understanding that something lay underneath the behaviour. And we might see that as a very common sense kind of view to take. But the fact that it wasn't a common sense view to take tells me that there's something about the criminal justice system itself that makes it very difficult to have those kind of relational conversations. I mean, one example that I came across would be that sometimes those really difficult conversations and those difficult questions are done on a piece of paper because they need to have them tick boxed, and they're done through a prison door or in an open plan office. They're done in ways that feel intuitively not safe. So you're unlikely to expand that conversation then, aren't you? If you're not in a safe building, in a safe relationship, can see the person so you can detect safety, why on earth are you going to engage in the question, have you been sexually abused? Which is a question that I learned was asked through a prison door.
Yeah.
So I mean, these are the things we need to sort of grapple with if we're going to take on this approach of having those difficult conversations and feeling equipped to cope with them, because some people don't feel equipped to cope with the answer.
Yeah. And I see that a lot when, you know, I see lots of young people that are trying to access their care files, and people are, you know, professionals, and I find this fascinating, really, that actually the vast majority of people that I know that have experienced care think that it's absolutely the right of the young person to understand the information that's in them care files. How they get that, well, that's up to us to do as professionals, because a child shouldn't get to 18, as far as I'm concerned, and be saying, I want my care files because I don't understand why I came into care. What should have happened is there should have been an ongoing narrative with that child at a different stage of development to be able to drop and plant them seeds, so that by the time they get to 18, they're not saying, I want to access my care files, because they're saying, I'm well aware of the reasons that I've come into care, because it's our job as professionals, as far as I can see, to help them deal with that. But people will often say, well, we'll open up a can of worms if we give them that, we give them that information. Well, if the kid's revolving around the criminal justice system, that can of worms is well open. Our job, as far as I can see, is to help them understand that can of worms, and to be able to articulate their own story. Of course, there's a developmental phase, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't have the information, because we can't assume that not having the information is good for them either, if that makes sense. But I think that it can be difficult for, it can be, sometimes professionals, you see, maybe with lived experience like ours, maybe it puts us in a bit of a privileged position, and maybe we're assuming that people can do this stuff. And actually, maybe a little bit of what you said there, it's a training issue, or people, particularly probation officers, when you're going into the adult world. I did do some training recently with probation, and it was ironic when I turned up at the door and they said, I didn't think you'd know where the building was. I said, I've been here quite a few times at service users, so I knew where the building was. But we looked at care leavers and the need to understand some context of that individual's lives. And when we got into conversations, a lot of the probation officers were saying, well, we wouldn't necessarily ask them questions. I'm saying, well, just ask them. Ask them. You know, Dr. Dan Siegel talks a little bit about being seen, and I don't think whether it's you're a young person and you're being parented, or whether you're an adult, we all want to think that some people see us for who we are, not for what we've done. So just try to understand my narrative and my journey rather than focus on my behaviour.
Yeah, and it's not, you know, it's not rocket science, like you say. And I think we met, actually, I think one of the conferences that we did meet, was it the one that was about care leavers in prison? I think you might have been there. And I was petrified about doing that particular talk, because I just knew I'd have a sea of faces, and I just thought, I assumed that a lot of what I was talking about would be known stuff. And I was really, really surprised that actually it isn't known stuff, and that there isn't really an understanding about what it means to be a young person in prison who has a care story, history, background is still in care, what that means for the visits they might get or might not get, what that means for the way that the opportunities they have to process what's going on and what's happened, what that means for their vulnerability, their neurological development. All of those things are really missing. And I was really pleased to hear that they had actually recruited somebody specifically to do that work. And just for the purpose of the podcast, we know that the Care Leaves Association have done a lot of work around building peer-to-peer groups in different prisons of care experienced people. Because the other thing that's interesting, and you might have something to say about this, is of course that those questions are very difficult to ask maybe for professionals, but as a young person in prison, answering those questions is also a very complicated thing, because if I tell you something about myself, is that going to affect my parole? Is that going to affect the way that other people see me? Is that going to make me look vulnerable? Is that going to mean that you treat me differently? There must be a whole range of things going on internally before there's a decision to answer a question. So already there's all these things in the way of those kind of conversations.
And that's, for me, that's why I think we should always go back to the relationship side. So if a young person, particularly a young adult, comes into a young offenders institution or a prison, and you say, have you been in care? They may well be reluctant to tell you, because if they've got a child, is that going to impact the fact that Children's Social Work Service are going to go knock on the door? So they will have all them connotations going on. So, but for me, the prison system, as far as I can see, and we need prison. People will always, forever, as far as I'm concerned, need to be in prison, but it doesn't have to be as it is. There is a complete and utter disconnect between prisoners and prison officers, and I think that could significantly be improved with a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of expertise around the things that we're talking about now. And I think that would go some way to helping prison officers empathise, not sympathise, but understand where the prisoners, vast majority of them, are coming from. You see, one of the other things as well that I find interesting is we say 25% of the adult prison population are care experienced. Well, in Leeds, I wanted to look at that a little bit more, because I wanted to say, what does that actually tell us? Because, I've had a couple of people approach me on Twitter and be almost borderline offended by me making a link between, care experience or explaining that 25% of the adult prison population are care experienced. And I think we can solve that quite quickly, because it doesn't, 25% of the adult prison population being care experienced, or almost 2/3 of the young offenders institution being care experienced, it doesn't tell us anything. Because actually, when we looked at the data in Leeds, what we found is that that's a correlating factor, a contributing factor, but not the most significant. So education, health and care plans, most of the young people who've experienced care and come into our service are on education, health and care plans. They're not getting excluded anymore, because we don't exclude children anymore, but then out of mainstream education. So that's another one. Most of them have been in care less than 6 years, and that's significant, because we only work from 10 to 18-year-olds, and most of them closer towards the 18. So if they've only been in care 6 years, that tells you that they've spent a significant part of their life, their early life, at home with their parents. So there are other things. So I think that actually we can draw a line in that and say that actually the care experience alone, in my view, doesn't link significantly to offending. It will link to a whole heap of other things. If you're going from placement to placement to placement, it will impact on how you feel connected to people, attachment, homelessness. Will impact on a lot of other things. But I don't think that 25% of adult prison population being care experienced tells us a full picture. I think we need to know a little bit more about them, the life journey of that 25%, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's such a valid point, because if we look at most things that appear to have a correlation, actually there's loads and loads of things going on, and it's difficult because people like things to be nice and straightforward. Yeah. We want to know, so this happens, so that means that will happen, and this happens, so that, and of course life isn't like that. We're messy, complicated, and we are, as we just talked about, we have this complex mishmash of what we bring to the party within our DNA, the kind of experience we have in the womb, the ability and capability of the caregivers, of the community, of all the interactions that happen to us, but also the intergenerational stuff, the circle. And one of the things I've noticed with my children, which has been really hard, and I almost don't want to tell you this because your child's 4, but your story will be very different to mine. But having raised 2 children into adulthood and watching them go through adolescence and transition, that circle of trauma, however hard I've tried, to break that cycle, and I have been better than what came before, and I believe my children will be better than I was, and I guess that's the nub of it. But I see that cycle of trauma, and the stuff that they've got from me, the stuff they got from their dad, the stuff that goes way back generationally, previously, on both sides. And these are the kind of things that we need to develop our awareness of, which is, if we understand the complexity of what gets a person to arrive at the point they're at, whether that's a great space or not a great space, that just enhances compassion for that person and means that we can meet somebody where they're at without getting too bogged down in why is that person there. For whatever reason, you're working with someone who is really struggling right now.
The thing for me as well is, so, I mean, again, Dan Siegel talks a little bit about presence, doesn't he? And what, I think for me, you've just explained the fact that actually, these things are going on, but you're quite aware of them. And when I think about my mum raising me, and I know my mum really well, she's just not aware that they're happening. So she's emotionally unavailable, and she's not fully understanding her biology, for her, her reaction to the things that have happened in her childhood. And I guess not everybody is ever going to do that. And I guess that for me, I sometimes do things. And sometimes, even with Isabel, she's nearly 4, I can be a little bit sharp sometimes. And then I recognise that that's happened, and then I give myself a break, because I just think, you know what, Andy, you're a human being. Look at all the things you've been through, so you haven't responded very well, but you can repair what's just happened, and that helps her regulate. And these are all the things that I'm aware of because of my job and the research that I've done. But not everybody's got that, and I think when they don't have that, when families don't have that, the thing that hurts me the most, and I wasn't around post-war, but I would imagine that people just got together and people helped each other, and they had hope, and they built bonds and bridges, and they overcome hurdles together. Because I believe fundamentally we are relational creatures. We need each other. And I think we've gone down a route where we're telling everybody, you need to stand up on your own 2 feet, and you need to be successful, and you need to have all these things. And I think that's damaging our children. I think it's because children are not made to be like that. They're made to, have attachments to people around them that care for them, that nurture them, that give a sense of community. And I hate the direction in which we're going, because I don't think it gives us, for those people that are unable to parent their children in the right way. I can give you an example of a family who was working with, and recently, I mean, they caused a lot of problems for the neighbours, but when they were moved out forcefully, the neighbours were outside clapping. And I think, for me, that pains me, that, because although I understand the issue wholeheartedly, but what if the whole street wrapped around that family, and the whole street wrapped around them children, and said, you know what, we can see you struggling here, so the kids are going to come and eat at my house, or I can see you struggling there, so I'm going to take the kids to school. And that would make a better place for children to grow up in. But some of these areas that you've got the lowest paid people, with the lack of resources and the lack of time, because mum and dad's working so hard. And I guess I've just gone off in a little bit of a wider context, but I think when we look at all the rise in mental health in our young people, and crime hasn't actually risen, but we're talking about knife crime on the TV quite a lot now. And I think that unless we get that back, that's the way to reduce it. It's not to criminalise children. It's not to create more authority. It's a sense of community and a sense of belonging. And I'm not sure whether we've gone too far to get that back, but that's where I would like to see us go as a society, to try and reprieve some of that, if you like.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I was on a webinar last night, and you know, for me, the key message is, how do you want to show up every day? How do you want to show up? And I want to show up as that neighbor. I want to show up as that person that helps somebody who's fallen over. I want to show up as somebody who cares about the society that I live in. I want to contribute to reducing environmental harm. You know, that's how I want to show up. And if those young people that you're working with, if that's a question that you can have with them at any point, how is it you want to show up in this world? You know, I think from what you've said to me, you've got some really smart kids there in front of you who are thoughtful and reflective. And, you know, they're the next generation. They're the people that will be where you are, you know, in 20 odd years' time, because that's one of the things we do know, is that people with lived experience go on to work in different professions that are about creating change for the better. And so I always want to say to people, you are working with that generation of kids who are going to work in the services in different professions to make the world a better place. So I'd be fascinated to know, if you get the opportunity to ask them, how do you want to show up in the world, and see what they answer.
Yeah. And I see for many of the young people, I guess the one thing I would say, because I don't come across many lived experience people working in the criminal justice system, and I think that there's probably variation of different reasons why. I don't know how I've managed to blag my way in, to be totally honest with you, sometimes when I sit and reflect on it. But the idea, when I work with a young person, regardless of the offence they've committed, I can't help but think, well, why couldn't you be my manager in 20 years? That, you know, that's not beyond your reach. Because if you would have come to, I was last released from Lindholm Prison in 2005. If you would have come to me and knocked on my cell door and said to me, by 2019, you're going to have written a book, qualified in youth justice, and you're going to be sat talking to Lisa Cherry on a podcast that's going to go out, you know, I would have said, shut my door and get going with you. So you just never know, do you? You can never, ever predict. And I'm sure lots of people that came into contact with me as a young person would have assumed, well, I know anyway, because I know some of the relationships I had with some of the professionals, but they would have assumed that maybe there was a limit to where I could go. And I think when I come into contact with a young person, I just believe there's absolutely no limit. I can't believe anything else, because I don't believe I'm superhuman, or I'm just a guy that's just plodded along with a bit of grit and determination, and I've done all right. And so some of these kids that I'm working with, I was 24 when I was last released from custody. Some of these kids are 18-year-old, so they could fly if they get the opportunity. So I think that is a key question. I probably will take that forward, actually, and that's a question that I will ask some of our young people that we're working with, and I'll probably feed back to you what some of their answers are.
That would be brilliant, and they're so lucky to have you, Andy. Thank you so much for joining me this evening on the podcast, and I wish you every single highest management position ever across your life possible.
I don't think I'm ready to be a manager just yet.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. Take care.